This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 149. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Well, welcome back. I'm so happy to have you here with me again. Happy Friday. It's podcast day. And so, I'm so happy to have you. And I hope you guys are well and safe and doing well. I have a very, very cool and exciting interview today to share with you. It's an amazing episode. I found it incredibly helpful for me personally. So I'm going to share that with you here in just a sec. But first, we are going to do the I Did a Hard Thing segment. And this week's I Did a Hard Thing is by Kathy, and she is from CBT School Campus, and she has said this: taking a virtual cooking class, and then I was cooking at home. That was her hard thing. She said, so much of my OCD has been about cooking. I have tried to make it fun by getting new cooking stuff and a fun apron, which I totally love. It helps me allow to push through the constant OCD noise. Now this, my friends, is gold. This is identifying a fear, willingness to face it, but also having some fun along the way. What a delight. I just love this. So well done, Kathy. You definitely did a hard thing. And I'm just so thrilled to be a part of that. Okay, today we have an amazing guest. This was actually a guest that was recommended to me by a very dear friend. She said, you absolutely need to interview this person. She is brilliant. And 100% was true. Today we have Heather Hansen. She is a trial attorney. She's a television legal analyst. She's a trained mediator, and she is the author of The Elegant Warrior: How to Win Life's Trials Without Losing Yourself. And I loved this. Everything that she's written and spoken about is amazing. She also has her own podcast called The Elegant Warrior. And what an amazing human being. Now, the thing I really found interesting, in addition to just the work that she's doing, is this idea about being a woman and being exposed to this, what is known as a fairly male predominant industry, the legal industry, right? The legal area. I just love hearing about women who jump into that. Really, it just empowers me so, so much. But Heather here today talks a lot about, again, how to win over your own self-jury, right? So when she's in court, a big part of that is about getting the jury to see her client's point of view. And she said often we have a jury in our head that's telling us how bad we are and how, we're not going to get good things done and we won't get better. And she said sometimes there are some skills to manage that. And she talks about so many cool things here. Again, I was actually taking notes the whole time for myself. So I'm going to give you over to Heather. She is an amazing human being. You can go over and check out all of her information is at the very end of the podcast. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Well, welcome. I am so thrilled to have here with us Heather Hansen. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, Kimberly. I love your podcast. It's such a help to so many.
Thank you so much. And you are a host of a beautiful podcast too, right? So I'm going to give all those, I'm going to give you time to tell us all about that. But what I really want us to get into is tell us about your message, because it's such a cool message. I want to hear all about it.
So for 20 years, I have been a trial attorney, and I am very good at advocating for my clients in the courtroom. I use evidence and I build credibility and I ask questions and I make arguments and I ask for what my clients want. But I wasn't always so good at advocating for myself and asking for what I wanted and using credibility and using evidence and making arguments. And so in the past, I'd say 5, 6 years or so, I have been working with people, a lot of women, a lot of corporations, on how to use the tools of a trial lawyer and advocate for yourself and your ideas, your business, your needs, and your wants.
Wow. See, that's what I just love how you've merged the two together. When did that come to you? Like, what was the moment where you made that merge of the two?
Well, I came just as most people who have these big epiphanies, it happened in a moment of sort of stress. So I had just finished a trial. In my cases, I represent doctors when their patients sue them. And that can be really hard because I have a lot of sympathy and compassion for the injured patient. And yet, oftentimes, most of the time, I know that my doctor did everything right. And I know that I also have a job to do. So this was a case where the patient had sued my doctor and claimed that my doctor hadn't taken a correct medical history and hadn't written down correctly the medications he was taking. And as a result, he had a seizure because he had withdrawal from his medicines and he broke 5 of his vertebrae, Kimberly. So he sued the doctor, saying that the doctor hadn't taken the correct medications. And in my cases, I have to take depositions where I ask the patient all the questions I can think of so that when I come to trial, I can pick the questions that are best going to help me win my case. And so I went to the deposition and the patient was there and he was super anxious. And the anxiety was causing him stomach problems and he was crying and he kept running to the bathroom and we couldn't do the deposition because he was so sick and so anxious. So we had to come back another day. And when we came back the other day, the same thing happened. He was anxious. He was running to the bathroom. He was freaking out. And finally, I got down sort of on my hands and knees and I looked him in the eye and I said, "What can I do to make this better?" And he said, "I'm wearing these big, heavy boots. And I feel like if I didn't have my boots on, I'd be more comfortable." And he was wearing those Timberland boots, the yellow ones. Yeah. So I untied them and I pulled them off for him. And he seemed to feel better. And we were able to get through his deposition. So then it came time for trial. And I was ready for the trial. I had compared his deposition answers to the medical records and to the things that he had told the nurses and the doctors in the hospital. And I knew that his story was just not right. And I knew it was my job to show that to the jury. So I was getting ready to cross-examine him at trial, and I had all my notes and my hair in my ponytail, and I was ready to go. And right before he went to get on the stand, he came over to me with his mother. And he said, "Mom, this is that nice lady I told you about, the one who helped me with my shoes at my deposition." And she gave me this great big hug and was like, "Thank you so much for being so kind to my son." And then he got on the stand and I had to cross-examine him. So, we call the rooms where we prepare for trials war rooms. And we call the stories that we tell about our trials war stories. And I am a warrior in the courtroom. And so I had a job to do and I did it. I cross-examined him and I pointed out all the ways that he was contradicting himself and he was contradicting the nurses and he was contradicting his own records. And I could tell from the jury's body language that I was winning, that they were agreeing with me and I was taking away his story and I was doing my job. But when I went to the car at the end of the day that day, I cried. Because who was I? Was I this elegant, compassionate woman who got on her knees to help a man in pain? Or was I the strong warrior who could attack a story because I had to do that for my client? And that's sort of where my book was born. The Elegant Warrior is the idea that you can maybe be both some days. But I also that day recognized that I didn't want to be a warrior as often as I was. I didn't want to be trying as many cases as I was. And that meant that I was going to have to start advocating for myself to do the things that I wanted to do. I wanted to do more television and become a TV legal analyst. I wanted to write a book and have the time to do that. I wanted to start a podcast. And I'd have to start advocating for myself to get all these things that I wanted. And I realized that I could use the tools that I used in the courtroom to do that for myself as well.
Right. Now, this is so fascinating. I mean, I just find this so interesting because the whole legal system, I don't know a lot of, but I always sort of admire those women who are just so strong. And I kind of like want to be you when I get older. But I love how this applies to, a lot of what we talk about, which is mental health and not only advocating for ourselves in the mental health field, but also advocating to ourselves. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that I think is the most important thing. When I listen to your podcast and I think about anxiety, I think so much about the jury of voices in our heads. Because, if your jury are the people that you need to influence and persuade and convince, so often you have those voices in your head that are telling you, it's time to be anxious. This isn't right. Things aren't going to work out, or you're not good enough. You're not strong enough. You're not smart enough. You're not old enough. You're not young enough. And before you can go out and advocate for yourself with your mental health professionals or in the medical system or at work, you need to convince those voices inside of your head that you can do this, that it will be okay, that you can handle whatever comes down the pike. And you can do that with the same tools that you use to advocate to others.
Right. The reason I was so excited is because I'll tell you a personal story just because it's so applicable to me right now. So I am halfway through writing my first book. And on Monday, which was 4 days ago, was my deadline for the second batch, which was halfway. And I, at one point this week, just fell apart, like crying, and I'm usually such a confident person. And my husband came in and he was like, what happened? And I told him and he's like, this is just self-doubt. This is all self-doubt. Like, where did you get this stuff from? Which was so fascinating to me. It just went downhill really fast. So tell me if you found somebody in that position or talk about what you would do.
So I think that, as I said, the same tools that I'd use in the courtroom. So one of the main tools I use with myself when I'm experiencing self-doubt or worry is evidence. So you have so much evidence that you've been able to do the things that you've wanted to do. You've started this podcast. You've overcome anxiety. You've overcome a lot of health issues. I listened to your podcast about all the health things that you went through last year. I mean, each piece, I do a lot of coaching one-on-one with clients, and I ask them to collect evidence. Every day at the end of the day, write down all of the things that you're proud of, little things, Kimberly. It has to be, so many times we think it has to be like a big promotion or a big raise, but it might be that you created some time blocks for yourself and you did them, right? So that's evidence of your ability to stick to a schedule. Or you had a difficult conversation with a partner, and that's evidence of your ability to handle a little bit of stress in communications and get through it. And when you start collecting the evidence, you start to build your own credibility with yourself. And that's one big way. So evidence is a huge one. And then credibility is another. So I'm big into roots of words. I think words are powerful and magical, but I want to make sure I'm using them in the way that they're intended. And the root of the word credible is to believe. You can't advocate for something until you believe in it. So you can't advocate for yourself until you believe in yourself. And the way that you earn that is by getting through your self-doubt. And it's also by making promises and keeping them and setting expectations and meeting them. So even though you had the self-doubt, I'm sure you got that in the way that you were supposed to. Of course you did. You're nodding your head like, yes, of course. That is such a fabulous way to build your own credibility. To believe in yourself. When you tell yourself you're going to do something, you have because you've done it before. So those are two of the tools that I use in the courtroom that anyone can use in their life when they're talking to themselves to win.
Right. And so that's so interesting because I think other people can collect evidence for us. The funny thing is I fell into self-doubt after I handed it in. It's not like I couldn't hand it in. I'd done all the work and then all of the doubt came in. Other people can see and say, well, look at all the things you've done. What if you're having a hard time trying to find that evidence?
Yeah, I think that's why you have to do it on days when you aren't having the doubt. In the moments of doubt, you, of course, have a hard time. And I had a similar experience. When I handed in the book, Kimberly, I had a meltdown because it's like, I don't have any kids, but I would imagine it's like having a baby and then putting it out to the world and saying, do you think it's cute? Please write a review for my baby on Amazon. Like it's ridiculous how it makes you feel so open and vulnerable. But I think that that's why you have to do it every day and not wait for those moments when you're in self-doubt. And then you have to, in those moments, if you haven't collected your evidence, you can look to the people who love you to give that evidence, but it's much better if you're keeping it on a day-to-day. And the other thing that I suggest, so I'm creating a course because not everyone can afford my one-on-one coaching prices, and I want to reach as many people as I can. So I'm creating a course on how to advocate for yourself. And the first module in the course is all about sort of hiring yourself. So there's all kinds of studies that show that when we talk about ourselves in the third person, it makes us more confident. It makes us have less self-doubt. It makes us less hard on ourselves. So evidence shows that men tend to do this more easily. If you look to a lot of sports figures like Andre Agassi, Pele, LeBron James, they would sometimes say, like LeBron James one time said, LeBron James has to do what's best for LeBron James.
Oh.
Actually talked about himself that way.
Right.
And it helps if you can do that because you start to see the person that is doubting as separate from the person who has confidence.
Right.
Now, for women, my research for I'm working on my next book too. My research sort of shows me that women do better if we create an alter ego. So Beyonce had Sasha Fierce, and that was the person who went up and performed. And Mariah Carey had Mimi. And J-Lo, even for a little while, had an alter ego that she called Lola. But I think that when you have that self-doubt, if you can sort of create an alter ego that has the confidence, that has all of the traits that you want to have, you can sort of separate the person who's doubting from the person who has confidence.
Right. And this is so good. I've actually talked about this on the podcast really early about Beyonce, because I think that that is so helpful, particularly for my patients and clients. And a lot of my crowd every day are being faced with fear, and they have the decision whether they face it or they don't. Right.
Yeah.
And that's not an easy feat, but they are needing to sort of really muster up courage, and sometimes you do need that alter ego. So I think that that's where this message is so powerful.
Oh, I think it's so important. I say you have to hire yourself. You have to create. At the beginning of my career, I created an alter ego who was this tough, strong advocate who could go into the courtroom, and it's mostly men that I have my cases with. Only less than 5% of trial lawyers are women. And so who could go in and step up and argue and be confident. And the interesting thing for Beyonce and for me is she said that after some time, she didn't need Sasha Fierce anymore. And I do think that once you've done this for a while, you might not need that alter ego, or you might not need it in every situation, but only in some situations. But it's a great tool. Right. In fact, I have it on, you can probably see it, I know your audience can't, but I have a bracelet that I have that says advocate, that I remind myself when I put this on that I am an advocate for me. You have something like, in the courtroom, it was always a ponytail. When I put my hair in a ponytail, I became that other person. So for clients, if they're having trouble and struggling with this, have something, a bracelet, a pair of shoes, a certain perfume that you wear that turns you into that person.
Right. I always used to get made fun of in high school because when I would go into debate, I would pull my sleeves up. And I couldn't not debate unless I pulled those sleeves up. And that was, for me, it was like, okay, I'm here now. I'm going to do this.
That is right. That's exactly it. It puts a switch in your head. It also removes you a little bit from the situation so that you have a little bit of space to respond to things.
Right. I love this. Okay. So we're talking about this like credibility to believe. Where do you go from there?
Well, the other big tool, so I have 10 tools of an advocate, and we've touched upon 2. We've touched upon evidence. We've touched upon credibility. I think another one that's worth talking about with your fabulous audience is words. The words that we use are so important. In the courtroom, if I choose the right words that resonate with my clients, it really makes a difference. And so I'm very conscious of the words that I choose, especially when I'm talking to myself. So I don't know if you're familiar with the water experiments that of course I'm going to forget his name, but I'll send it to you and you can put it in the show notes. It's like, he's a Japanese scientist and author, who did experiments on water where he separated water into, yeah, you're nodding your head, you know this. He separated water into like two different glasses, and he would speak kind, nice, compassionate words to one glass, and he would speak nasty, terrible words to the other glass. And then he looked at them under microscopes. And the glass of water that had the nice, pleasant, happy, positive words were beautiful, clear, white, crystalline crystals. And the water that had the terrible language were brown and dark and dense. And he used that to prove the value of the words that we use. Now, currently, there's a woman named Danielle Laporte who I follow. I've read all of her books. And she's doing something called the apple experiment, where she's encouraging people to take an apple, split it in half, put half of an apple in saran wrap or something, and only speak nicely to it, and do the other half and speak negatively to it, and see what happens. And so if you look on Instagram right now, as we tape this, and do hashtag the apple experiment, you'll see pictures of people who are doing this, especially with their kids now that their kids are home. And in a lot of those pictures, you can really see the difference in the apples that have been spoke too nicely and not spoke too nicely. So I think that the choice of words that we use is really important, both in our self-talk, when we're talking to the jury of voices in our heads, and the people that we want to convince or persuade.
Right. I cannot get behind this anymore. This is what I speak mostly with my clients, particularly during COVID-19, which is where we're at right now, is often people, I'll say, how are you doing with, clients or patients or friends? And they'll say, I'm freaking out. And I'll say, oh, you're anxious? Like, what's going on? And they'll say, yeah, I'm just really worried. And I'll say, but they don't line up. Like, freaking out shows me you're in a tailspin. You're like, things are falling apart. But what you're reporting is some anxiety. But there's a massive gap between those and what you say to yourself.
Yes, it creates your reality. It truly creates your reality. If you think you're freaking out, then you will freak out. But if you think that you're concerned, the difference between anxious and concerned, I like concerned better. And at night, especially during COVID, I think we're all battling with anxiety. And I think that when I say to myself, I'm freaking out, I'm so anxious, I'm so worried, as opposed to I'm concerned. Concerned to me feels very focused. Okay, what are you concerned about? I oftentimes will go down rabbit holes, Kimberly, of looking up what words actually mean and where they come from, because I want to make sure that I'm using words. I think they're magic, and I want to use them appropriately. One of my favorite things on this is the word abracadabra. Like, that phrase comes from, I think it's Aramaic, but it means I speak things into existence.
Ooh.
It's actual magic, right? Like, abracadabra means I am speaking this into existence. And I think that if we remember that we can speak things into existence, we'll be much more conscious of the words we use.
I'm just writing that down. I love this so much. And I think it's so important. And it's funny because I think it also helps us slow down a little. When we think about actual words we're using, you can reflect a little bit and actually ask this is sort of like checking your facts. Like, yes. hang on a second. What did I say?
That's right. That's exactly the way that we use words in the courtroom, right? Because sometimes on cross-examination, when the other lawyer is attacking my doctor, he will take my doctor's deposition, the answers he gave, and change just one or two words when he's reading it, and it changes the entire meaning. And my job is to make sure that I catch him in that, right? To say, wait, that's not the word he said.
Right.
You're reading the jury with these one or two little words. And it does, I think you're so right that it gives us that space. There's such a difference between reacting and responding. And reacting is emotional. And sometimes it's the I'm freaking out. But responding is where you've given yourself a little bit of breath to see, what am I actually doing here? And how do I want to respond to this event, this feeling, this emotion?
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. So I've got a question. A lot of what we do when we're correcting thoughts when it comes to anxiety is we try to look for objective thoughts, right? Not subjective. So if someone says, I'm freaking out or I'm having this terrible anxiety, we would say, okay, no, you're experiencing discomfort. Right. So is the wording for you when you say like be careful about the words, do you try to go to objective or do you just try and find the specific word that's best?
So I try to go to objective, and it actually then takes us to the next tool of an advocate, which is perspective. Because what you're talking about is exactly what I talk about when I talk about perspective. I believe that what you see, the way that you see the world, influences what you think, what you feel, how you act, and then what you get. So I always say what you see is what you get. And if you say, I see the world as scary and dangerous, and everyone's dying of COVID, then you will think that the world is scary, dangerous, and everyone's dying of COVID. And what I try to do is say, how else could you see the world? To bring it down to the objective thoughts, right? So you could see the world as a place where lots of people are getting better and recovering and never having a single symptom of COVID. You could see the world of full of people and healthcare providers who are taking such good care. You could see that our hospitals are not being overstressed the way that we might be concerned. There's always another way to see things. And one, there's always the objective way, which is oftentimes the best way. But even if you can't come up with that, I challenge my clients to look at as many ways they can see something as possible. So how else could you see it? And how else? And how else? And how else? And then choose the perspective that best serves you. You can look at the world as dangerous and people are dying, or you can look at the world as getting better and people are healing. And which better serves you? And sometimes in the midst of anxiety, I know for myself, I think, it serves me to think of it as dangerous because then I can control and protect. And then you have to look at that thought, right? Like, can you really? And it's very similar to, as you say, bringing it back to objective facts. These are just circumstances and you are interpreting them through the way that you see the world. So let's see if there's other ways that you can see it.
It's so fascinating how the world comes because this is such the level that I've been thinking lately. What's really showing up for me in my work is the extreme degree in which we lean towards the negative bias, right? And I've been challenging people like, let's be a little risky and actually lean to the positive bias. What would that look like? And so, I really think that that's fascinating. Like you're saying, look at many options and then choose the one that's going to help you and motivate you and move you forward.
Well, it has served us. I often talk about the lizard brain, which is the part of your brain that is concerned with survival. So it's looking at where's the threat, always looking around for threats. I mean, that is a part of your brain that allowed you to survive. And so that is always going to be looking for the danger. And that's good. You don't want that to stop, but you also want to look for the good. And I always encourage my clients to at least give 50-50. If you're going to look at all the danger, at the very least, give equal time to the positive. And then at the end of the day, if you want to stick with the danger, that's your choice. But give your brain a break. Let your fear. Elizabeth Gilbert, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love and
Big Magic.
Great book. And Big Magic, I think, is the book where she talks about having, if your fear, and if you were going on a car ride, fear can come along for the ride. You're not going to leave it at home, but it can't drive. It can't give directions, and it can't even control the radio. It's got to sort of sit in the back seat and mind its business.
Do what it's told.
The lizard brain. I'm like, the lizard brain can be there, but you sort of want to let it lay in the sun and be comfortable and let it know it's safe, but not play with it all day, not be there with it, because we really have our best thinking and our best relationships out of a place that's much better than the lizard brain.
Yeah, I see this. This is so great. If you were working with a client and they really are struggling to step up into like the alter ego and sort of the positive bias, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I do a whole series of exercises with evidence where we really go deep on their evidence, and it takes time. It's sort of like a series. So we will talk about the evidence, and then we will feed the alter ego with the evidence, and then we'll talk about the evidence, and we'll really create an alter ego. Like, what does she look like? What does she act like? What would she say? A big part of it is, and then some of it too, Kimberly, is actually practicing. what you're going to say. If I have a client who's super nervous about asking for a raise or a promotion or speaking up for themselves in a relationship for better boundaries, we will practice certain lines that they can use and sort of go-to lines. In my book, The Elegant Warrior, I talk about that a little bit, going back to like in times of the Me Too movement and saying, I don't think that's funny. I find it offensive. Like that was a go-to for me. A lot of times I recommend that people use another tool of an advocate, which is questions. So if you go back to a question when you're feeling stressed and you're feeling like you're sort of being attacked or you're afraid to ask for a promotion, having some questions in your mind can sometimes help you to alleviate that as well. And then practicing those. It is not something that is going to come easily to us all the time, and it shouldn't. You need to give yourself credit for the small steps that you make, and then you continue to build your credibility. You continue to build your evidence, and you allow that alter ego to get stronger and stronger until maybe you don't even need her anymore.
So good. Do you have an alter ego with your community too? Or when you're in court? Like, do you imagine? So the reason I ask is when I first started doing podcasts, I actually created a person who I was going to talk to, because otherwise I'd go blank. Like I just would get overwhelmed at like, who am I speaking to? So I kind of created Monique, and she lives here and she has one child, and I sort of envisioned her. So do you also use that on the flip side to sort of help fine tune?
Well, that's so interesting because, many people in my marketing for my business have encouraged me to do that. The challenge for me is that in my legal work, my clients were so different. I've represented men and women and nurses and doctors and surgeons and medical doctors and obstetricians who deliver babies. And so I could never in that world envision just one, because they were all so different and practice such different types of medicine. And I do struggle with it now because while I do have the large majority of my clients for coaching are women, in my corporate world, I serve a lot of men as well. So it's sort of more like I imagine a group than a single person. But I do think that it is effective to practice thinking about who you're addressing. So if you're nervous about, again, asking for a raise or asking your partner for better boundaries, imagine that person when you're practicing, because sometimes it can cut both ways. The way that you do it, it's Monique. I think you said her name was Monique? That she's probably lovely and receptive and nodding her head and, really interested in the conversation. But you can also be facing someone who might not be so lovely and receptive. And you want to be prepared for that body language that might not be what you want it to be and not have it be a surprise to you.
Right. You just mentioned, I have another question. So how important is body language in your work and this work?
Huge. So it's two different tools of an advocate, because the part that my clients always want to focus on is presentation. Like, how do I look? How do I sound? How do I move my face? How do I move my body? And that's very important. We'll get to that. We'll put that aside for just a minute, because before we get there, I want them to think about reception. How do you receive the other person? Most importantly, tone of voice. Because tone of voice is so important in how we understand each other. A study out of Yale shows us that we can tell more about someone's emotions, like whether they're happy, sad, from their tone of voice than from their body language and their facial expressions combined. Because, we grow up learning how to smile when we're sad and act happy when we're not, but our voices sort of betray us and tell the truth. And so I really want my clients to be listening to the other side and asking questions and listening to the answers and watching the other side's body language, because that is a really important way to build connection and to influence your jury. The other thing I talk about in that is mirroring. If your jury, if the person you're trying to convince is leaning forward, then you want to lean forward as well. If they're nodding, you want to nod. That's a really great way. And all kinds of studies show that the neurons in our brain help you to make connections when you mirror. And then once we've talked about receiving, we can talk about presenting. And there's so much. Kimberly, we could talk a whole hour about body language, because there's so much about, for example, hand motions. because that lizard part of your brain that we talked about before, it likes to see hands, because when it sees hands, it knows I'm not holding a weapon. Well, if I keep my hands constantly out of right now we're on camera, and right now in COVID, most of us are communicating on camera. And if you constantly keep your hands out of the camera, that lizard part of your brain is getting anxious, even if you don't know it. That's why so many people say at the end of the day, when they've been on Zoom calls all day, they feel more anxious, because your lizard brain all day has been like, what's going on? This person, it's bad. I can't tell if this person has a weapon, and I can't tell how close they are to me, whether or not they could hurt me.
Right.
Because I can't tell that. So you really want to try in real person and on camera to use your hands appropriately. You don't want to be like flailing around, but you want to use your hands in a way that is consistent with the way you normally would talk, so that you're sort of putting the other person's lizard brain at ease.
Right. You know what's so interesting is I just had this conversation with another clinician yesterday. She said, I'm sort of noticing that I'm starting to feel like angry at people. And then we talked about it, and we basically, her and I are friends, so it's not like we're giving therapy, but we basically figured out, because we don't see people as much, we don't get that reassurance that we're good, right? We don't get that, like, I'm loved, I'm okay, I'm accepted. And she said, I was starting to feel defensive with people because she wasn't getting that.
Totally. There's so much about this. Listen, there's positives too. We're lucky to be able to connect this way. I don't know what we'd do without it. But there's a lot about being on camera. We talk about the five senses, but there's really more than five senses. There's thermoception, which is feeling the heat of other people's bodies when they're close to you. And there's proprioception, which is feeling the air move around our bodies as we interact with each other. And we don't have those on camera, nor do we have smell or touch or taste. And so it really does create some anxiety. And there is that lack of positive feedback. There's a lot of things about it, but there's a couple of ways to use your body on camera. One is using your hands. The other is really trying to look at the camera and not at yourself, or even in the eyes of the person that you're speaking to, because that helps to create that connection as well. So body language, I do a ton of work on body language, but I'm always really, like, even in the book I'm writing, it's going to be at the end, because before, everybody wants to jump there because it's sort of the fun stuff. And you feel like if you can sort of establish this persona, then you don't need to work on the other stuff. But the other stuff is the most important stuff. And then at the end, you do want your body language to be serving you well.
Oh, I love this. This is so good. I'm so happy that we had this conversation personally, because it was perfect timing. But I think everybody needs to hear this.
No, it really is. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you and through you to your audience, because I think that the work that you're doing is so important. I remember when I first listened to your podcast, I was away on vacation and I was listening to one of your podcasts on health anxiety. And it's interesting because all those years of defending doctors in medical malpractice cases has given me some health anxiety. Because all I see is the worst, right? So I don't see... I'll actually share this with your audience. Years ago, I had a breast lump and I freaked out, and I couldn't get in for a mammogram for weeks, and I knew I was not going to sleep. And so I ended up calling a friend who had been a client who was a breast surgeon, and he got me in sooner. And everything turned out okay, thank God. But he said to me, "Why are you such a freak?" And I said, because when I see a breast lump in my professional work, it always leads to cancer. And usually it's unrecognized and it's terrible. It's always terrible results. But he sees breast lumps all day that are nothing.
Yeah.
It really shows you, again, the value of perspective, that if you see things differently, you can have a different thought about it. But the work that you do on that and the way that you help, just listening to your podcast about it, I forget which one it was, but I know you've talked about it a lot when COVID started as well. But it was enormously helpful, and I know it's enormously helpful to your audience. So if I can contribute just a little bit to that, I'm grateful.
Yeah, thank you. I love this, and it's so important. I think the reason I really feel like this is exactly what people need to hear is, I think when COVID-19 started, everyone was just adjusting and figuring it out. And interestingly, across the board, all of my patients and clients have hit this sort of like wall of like, we still don't know what's happening, but we're in a rhythm, and that the voices and the self-doubt and all of that is coming up, which is why this is so perfect.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that. I always tell my clients, it's like we were in a snow globe that was shaking. And so for a while, it was just like, just stay still and try to figure out what's going to happen. And now we're starting to get to the point where we're not shaking anymore and the snow is starting to settle. And now that also causes anxiety because we have to figure out what to do next and how to do it. And I do hope that these tools will help people to recognize, because now more than ever, you've got to be able to ask for what you want in the most effective way possible.
Yeah. So, and what I would add to that is what you say, and I know it's in your book and in your podcast, is to ask for what you want from others, but also to check in and ask for what you want from yourself, right?
It always starts with you.
Yeah.
It always starts with you. I mean, ultimately, you can get almost everything you need from yourself, which is wonderful when you recognize that. But you've got to do the work with yourself in order to get there. You've got to know yourself. I told you I'm obsessed with words. The reason that I'm so obsessed with the word elegant is because the root of that word is to choose, just like elect. And I believe that you choose your elegance. Elegance to me isn't necessarily, it's one of the questions I know you're going to be a guest on my podcast. One of the questions I ask every guest is, what is your definition of elegance? Because I believe you choose your elegance. And then the hard part is staying true to that choice when things get difficult.
Right.
And making sure that you're responding instead of just reacting.
Right. So good. So good. Where can people find out about you and get in touch with you? Tell us about all that.
The best place to find me for courses and my podcasts are my website, which is heatherhansenpresents.com, and Hansen's with an E-N. So that's heatherhansenpresents.com. And there you'll find my book, which is The Elegant Warrior. You'll find my course, which is going to start later this summer. I'm going to start the course. It's going to be an 8-week course with some one-on-one group coaching as well. And then the podcast is there as well. And the podcast is called The Elegant Warrior.
Thank you. And can you get the book other places as well, or just through your website?
It's Amazon. You can get it on Kindle. The audiobook I read, which was an endeavor. Are you going to be reading yours?
No, mine won't be going to, because it's more of a clinical workbook.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's clinical.
Reading it was definitely hard, but yeah, and I'm glad it's in my voice. So the audiobook is available on Audible, Kindle. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at local bookstores as well.
Right. I've read this. I want to hear it in your voice. That's powerful. That's powerful.
It's definitely different. I know now that I'm working on my next book, which I think is going to be called Advocate with Elegance. And I will definitely read it out loud to someone before it goes to final, because when you're reading out loud, you feel more of a connection with the reader. And so I would change some of the languaging. In fact, when you listen to the Audible, you'll see that I add some things and I take some things out because it just seems more real when you're reading it.
Right. So good. That's my next thing. I'm going straight to Audible. Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for being on. This is just so amazing.
Oh, it's so my pleasure. I'm so grateful for the work that you do, and I'm excited to have you on mine.
Yes, I'm so excited too. This is just so good. And again, personally, very helpful for me as well. Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.